What is going on, y'all? James Hancock here. As you can tell, I'm in a different environment than usual. I'm out here in San Diego for Comic-Con. I'm already sunburned from walking around, but San Diego Comic-Con is my favorite week of the year. It is always a pleasure and a privilege to be here, especially when I've got a little bit of work to do. I've got a new short film called Cop Dog that we are going to be playing tomorrow at the Bill Plimpton panel, which is very, very cool. But it's also a great opportunity just to meet people, do some information gathering, etc., and so forth. So this video is going to be a little bit different. Basically, what it's going to be is a compilation of some footage that I gathered earlier today at some of the Hall H panels, as well as a review of the new movie Dunkirk. I basically played a little hooky and went and caught that flick. It's not going to be a full review because at the end of the day, and all I want to do is get in the bath and relax and stretch my feet and my sore legs. But Comic-Con's one of those crazy things where it's impossible to do all of it. There's no way you can do all of it. You sure as hell can't cover all of it. And if in the following videos I seem a little scatterbrained and a little hyperactive, it's because you're just trying to process so much information and so much sensory overload all at once that it makes it very, very hard to have long, clear, sustained thoughts and ideas. But I hope you will enjoy my brief coverage of some of the events from today. But without further rambling on my part, here is my first impression from the 11 o'clock Kingsman, the Golden Circle panel in Hall H. What is going on, everyone? I don't know if the audio in this is coming through or not, but this is James Hancock, and I'm here the first day of San Diego Comic-Con. As you can tell, this is one of the most beautiful, agreeable environments in the nation when it comes to like just dry, crisp, sunny weather. 70 degrees, nothing but maniacs and comic book freaks and movie freaks for miles around. And I just got into Hall H and saw the panel for Kingsman, the Golden Circle, and just wanted to really quickly throw down some reactions. Now, I should admit it ahead of time, this is going to be spoiler heavy. I mean, the whole point of seeing these panels and Q&As is that they give away stuff that you probably won't know from the trailers. So if you don't want any information about Kingsman, all I'll say is that the clips I saw were incredible, and the Q&A was absolutely delightful. But I'm probably going to tackle maybe I'll do the Q&A stuff first, and then dive into the clips in case people want to hear about that. But Taron Egerton was there, Halle Berry, screenwriter Jane Goldman. Here's some rowdy people over there. Who else there? Pedro Pascal, Channing Tatum, Colin Firth, but he refused to speak basically because he didn't want to give away anything from his part in the movie. But it was great. Jeff Bridges came out, and they're basically serving bourbon the entire time. If you've seen the new trailer, you know that the Statesmen are essentially the American equivalent of the Kingsmen, and rather than be tailors, they're like alcohol salesmen. They have like a giant distillery in Kentucky, so bourbon was definitely on everyone's mind. They were serving shots of bourbon up and down the panel, but Channing Tatum poured an entire pint or an entire glass for Halle Berry. Of course, the crowd started screaming like, "Chug it, chug it!" So Halle Berry, trooper that she was, she stood up, pounded that pint of bourbon, and about collapsed. And anyway, I'm a fan of Halle Berry for life for just showing some spirit and some backbone, because chugging a pint of bourbon, that's not something you ever want to do. In any case, they handed out all these great Kingsman t-shirts. Actually, you know what? Maybe I should put that sucker on. I'm gonna pause this video and put on my Kingsman shirt. Be right back. All right, I am back, and I've got my brand new Kingsman t-shirt on, which I'm pretty psyched about. I thought Kingsman, the Secret Service, was an absolutely dynamite flick, but I am pretty damn fired up for this as well because they're not a whole lot of R-rated superhero adaptations these days in the theater, apart from the movies being made by Matthew Vaughn. And everything they talked about on stage has got me incredibly fired up. Like Jane Goldman, the screenwriter, she talked about how the Statesmen are essentially an outsider or British point of view of a lot of positive and negative American stereotypes. So a lot of cowboy hats, a lot of boots, a lot of whips, a lot of lassos. There's a really, really funny debate about the pronunciation of lasso versus lasso, and that it's a British crew. A lot of them called it a lasso, but they asked Pedro Pascal to weigh in on whether or not it was going to be a lasso or a lasso. He deferred to Jeff Bridges because he figured Jeff Bridges was probably the most country of everybody up there, and Jeff Bridges he took a shot of bourbon and said, "We just call it a rope," which I thought was the perfect response. But the three clips they showed were basically an extended action sequence from the car that we've seen in the trailer, which was totally badass. It's basically the guy with the mechanical arm fighting Taron Egerton. We've got a lengthy scene where Mark Strong and Taron Egerton are breaking into the Statesman's kind of home base, and Channing Tatum takes them on, and it's an absolutely badass fight scene. But the big one was seeing Julianne Moore and her base and how her organization, the Golden Circle, is run. And it's basically a scene where she's bringing in two potential stooges or henchmen, and one of them makes a cut and one of them does not. And so what she has, basically, she has one of them prove their loyalty by shoving him into a giant like hamburger meat grinder, and while the meat's being ground up and she starts preparing it into a burger, the other henchman goes over and gets like his fingerprints removed. But when he gets back to the room with Julianne Moore, he has to make his final gesture of loyalty by eating the cheeseburger that was made out of his friend. Pretty gross, gruesome stuff. Well, my arms are getting really tired from holding my phone up, and I realized that this footage is probably a little bit shaky as a result from my arms vibrating, so I'm just gonna wrap this up. But I do love the fact that Matthew Vaughn is basically injecting everything I know and love about classic James Bond flicks into a modern context, that we got legit hard R comic book adaptation in a time where we have too few of them. And granted, Logan and Deadpool were hard R, but I love the fact that Matthew Vaughn is doing, you know, controversial, provocative, irreverent material. And in a weird way, I honestly prefer the Kingsman franchise right now over the present day Bond. As much as I loved Casino Royale, and as much as I love Skyfall, the new Bond films are a little serious. And sometimes you need a movie that's gonna absolutely, with no apologies whatsoever, have the final shot just be a guy about to have butt sex with a Swedish princess. Call me immature, call me whatever you like, but that shit's fucking funny, and I just can't wait to see more of this come September. I'm thrilled that I got into Hall H on day one here at Comic-Con. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I have some more interesting news for you guys in the near future. So long. What's going on, y'all? James Hancock here. I am back a little later in the day, but I just caught the Netflix panel in Hall H. I've been trying to get into Hall H for years, and somehow today I've gotten into Hall H twice. But it's incredible seeing how Netflix has gone from a simple DVD service years ago to now being this content juggernaut. And they were presenting two giant movies, one which is Death Note coming out in a couple weeks, and the other which is Bright coming out in December. And these are movies with high-profile directors like Adam Wingard and David Ayer, you know, starring actors like Will Smith. It's just incredible how far Netflix has come. And I have to say, both of these projects really interest me. Death Note's based on a manga, and it's all about a guy who essentially meets like a death god played by Willem Dafoe. And if you write certain names in this book and a means by which they die, and then rapidly this power of his gets completely, totally out of control. And yeah, the trailer and the scenes they showed look absolutely killer, and Willem Dafoe is just born to play these kind of parts. But the one that really grabbed my interest was Bright, written by Max Landis. I mean, David Ayer, he's made a few movies like Suicide Squad, which have been disappointing, but I feel like those disappointments were not his fault. It was probably due to meddling and interference from other parties. But he also has movies like End of Watch, which are pretty goddamn cool. And Bright basically takes all the gritty LA cop stuff that he is known for and combines it with elves and orcs and fairies and magic and all kinds of cool shit. And it just looks absolutely killer. But they basically have taken all the kind of racial conflict that we're accustomed to in Southern California and replaced it with racial conflict between elves, orcs, humans, etc. And Will Smith was laughing about how much fun he had basically getting to be the mean old guy saying like, oh yeah, well, I don't want an orc in my car, because the way this universe is kind of constructed is that the elves are the elite, the humans are kind of middle management, and the orcs are essentially kind of blue-collar laborers. And Joel Edgerton plays the very first orc who's been allowed onto the police force, and Will Smith has to break him in as a partner. But at the same time, you know, a Bright is someone who is able to use magic, and typically they're elves, and there's a young elf who's got a wand, and she's essentially on the run, being chased by Noomi Rapace, I believe is how you pronounce the actress's name, but she's essentially the villain. And so you have an orc, a human, and an elf on the run being chased by all these badass elves who can absolutely fuck you up a variety of ways. But yeah, very excited to see that in December. Sadly, they only showed the trailer twice and nothing else. But another thing that was interesting was that David Ayer talked about how different it was working for Netflix versus working with a traditional studio, and how they never tried to convince him to do something like shoot in Atlanta and pretend like it was LA. Netflix would just basically ask him what was the best possible way that he could tell his story, and then do their best to make it happen. And it seems like David Ayer just really loved working for Netflix, because he was ranting and raving a bit about the constraints of working in what he described as a bullshit PG-13 studio mentality, and how confining it can be when you're trying to tell gritty stories. So you can tell David Ayer absolutely loves this change. And Will Smith was asked in the crowd about why he's so drawn to science fiction and fantasy concepts, and he admitted that when he was 10, he went to see Star Wars in the theater, totally blew his mind, and that essentially ever since then he's been chasing that experience again, but also really wants to try and provide it for moviegoers. So I think it's really cool that basically Will Smith recognizes the value of these extraordinary escapist entertainment adventure stories and how they can really just sweep you away, and how he just really wants to try to create that experience for as many people as possible. So yeah, all around, very cool panel, very fun first day of Comic-Con. I'm actually going to be probably drawing this to a close because I'm going to go check out Dunkirk, which I feel is as a good a way to end the day as any. But yeah, all around, awesome first day of Comic-Con so far. Looking forward to more Comic-Con goodness, and I'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye. All right, so I wrapped up my day by checking out Christopher Nolan's new film, Dunkirk. As amazing as Comic-Con is, and I'm sure I missed something incredible by going to see this movie, Christopher Nolan, when he releases a movie, it's an event, and I feel like that should take priority over some other concerns. I mean, from the time he made Memento through pretty much like Dark Knight and/or Inception, I saw all of his movies multiple times over. Interstellar, I've still only seen once. I probably need to go back and revisit it. But Dunkirk is a huge change of pace for him because there's nobody in tights, there's no science fiction, there's none of his otherworldly concept he usually deals with. This is a movie that just captures an incredibly harrowing but also inspirational moment in British history, where essentially 400,000 British soldiers were stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk, and it ultimately fell on the shoulders of a lot of local fishermen in the UK who were willing to sail across the channel and rescue all these people, because you had a combination of German U-boats and dive bombers making it utterly impossible for destroyers to evacuate all these men. And actually, some of these fishing boats were able to pick people up in a few feet of water, which is something that you can't do with the larger ships unless you have boats that take them out to it. So this is a movie that has almost no plot in a traditional sense. It has plenty of narrative because you have a couple different characters that you're following, like Tom Hardy as a total badass pilot, or Kenneth Branagh as somebody who's overseeing the evacuation efforts, or Mark Rylance, who's essentially like a luxury yachtsman who takes people out on fishing trips, who has decided it is his duty to go and try to rescue as many people as possible. But I have to say, it's one of those movies where for 2 straight hours, my entire body just felt like a clenched fist. I was just in, in agony watching this thing. I mean, it's not a movie that I would say anyone's going to enjoy. There are moments in the movie that are incredibly inspiring and incredibly moving, and there are parts where you will break out into tears. But if you're expecting The Dark Knight, this is a very different kind of experience. This is not trying to thrill or excite. It's essentially trying just to open our eyes to the amount of courage and self-sacrifice that a lot of people were willing to display in order to save their fellow Britons. But when it comes to the hardships these guys endure, from dehydration to being shot in the face to burned alive, some of these characters, it's almost like they just can't get a break. If they get onto one boat, it immediately gets sunk by the Germans, and then they find themselves in oil, which catches on fire, and they're holding their breath underwater only to come up into open flames. I mean, it is really brutal, intimidating stuff. On the other hand, though, it is shot in the most awe-inspiring fashion you could possibly imagine. I mean, the dogfight scenes between Tom Hardy and the Germans are just breathtaking. I mean, there's this incredible sense of urgency and impending disaster if he fails at what he's trying to accomplish, because these German pilots are just bombing the fuck out of British ships. And if Tom Hardy knows if he runs out of gas or if he makes a mistake, then people are going to die. It basically comes down to a point where he has to make the decision, is it worth it to run out of fuel and fight to the very last second and possibly save some more lives? Or do I turn back and save my own skin? And it's just, for a guy who has almost, I mean, you basically can't even see Tom Hardy's face the entire movie because he's covered in like an oxygen mask and goggles, because Christopher Nolan doesn't really like Tom Hardy to get to show his face in movies too much, because, as we all remember, he was Bane in Dark Knight Rises. Although I guess in Inception, he got to show his pretty mug a fair amount. But yeah, this is not a movie that I'm going to necessarily want to like get in line for 3, 4, or 5 times. And that's not a criticism. It's just, it's such an overwhelmingly traumatic experience watching it. It's hard to get excited to want to endure that again. But I will say this, as a result of experiencing and witnessing all these horrors that these soldiers are exposed to, when things start to go well, your heart just soars. So yeah, Christopher Nolan, I like the fact that we're seeing him enter this new, mature, ambitious phase of his career. I guess every movie he's ever made has been ambitious to a degree. And it seems like the one big knock against him is that he's kind of cold and passionless. I don't know if I 100% buy that criticism, but I can totally understand why people would feel that way, because it's not like Spielberg where the films are incredibly warm and endearing and you feel like these characters are part of your family. Christopher Nolan's much more clinical and objective in his approach, but when it comes to his filmmaking technique, there are very few filmmakers in the world who can touch him. 100% well worth seeing. Definitely worth taking 2 hours off from Comic-Con to go check it out. But I think I'm going to wrap this sucker up because it's been a very, very long day, and I've got a very long day ahead of me tomorrow. So I'm going to wrap this sucker up. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this brief little bit of Comic-Con coverage / Dunkirk review. If you want to talk more, you can hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrax, and please consider subscribing to my channel. Yeah, I don't know if I'll make a video tomorrow, but definitely we'll be making one probably Saturday or Sunday. But as always, onwards and upwards.